This has been an absolutely massive week across Greater Brisbane. This is an update video you won't want to miss. From the cost of living to cane toads, challenges to our future quality of life, analysis of efforts to reduce knife-related crime, and much, much more. This video is sponsored by YB Painting Services, and I'll tell you about the exclusive discount they're offering later. But here come the updates. We'll start with the cost of living updates: houses, rentals, and petrol. We don't need to spend too long on home prices, as there's no surprises there. While Sydney and Melbourne each saw a 0.1% drop in home values from November to December 2025, Brisbane saw them continue to rise, up 1.6%. Price increases for Sydney and Melbourne were 5.8 and 4.8% respectively over the year to December, while Brisbane's rose by about 3 times as much. But our increases weren't the highest out of Australia's capitals, with Perth's up 15.9% and Darwin's up a massive 18%. Despite those increases, Brisbane still sits at number 2 place on the list of the nation's most expensive capitals, with a median price of over $1.17 million in December. Sydney is firmly in number 1 place at close to $1.76 million. But how about rentals? Again, no great news there. Greater Brisbane rents rose by 6.2% over the year to December in Cotality's data, and 3.1% in the December quarter according to Domain. That quarterly increase was almost double the next highest, with Hobart seeing a 1.7% rise. But the silver lining is that the median rent of $670 per week in December for houses and $650 for units is lower than the median rental prices in Sydney, Perth, Canberra and Darwin. But rents are predicted to continue rising across Greater Brisbane, with high levels of interstate migration, particularly from Sydney and Melbourne, increased spending on infrastructure due to the upcoming Olympics, and more work opportunities to build it all, attracting workers, and supply simply not keeping up with the continually increasing demand. We'll get to some recently identified factors that have contributed to that lack of supply in a moment, but first let's get to another thing that's once again been found to be more expensive in Brisbane than any other Aussie capital: petrol. 2025 was the 3rd year in a row that Brisbane prices for unleaded petrol were the highest on average out of all capitals, with an average price of 185.2 cents per litre. This is according to data released by RACQ in its annual report. The cheapest suburb in Greater Brisbane for unleaded was Currabee, with an annual average of 162.8, and most expensive was in Burpengary up in Moreton Bay, averaging 201.4. For diesel, Brisbane was equal second most expensive, with Hobart behind Canberra. RACQ's principal economic and affordability specialist Ian Jeffries says the main contributing factors to our higher averages were longer price cycles, higher jumps, and shorter cheap phases. In addition, Brisbane has fewer small chains and independent service stations, which usually offer fuel at lower prices. The RACQ is advocating for greater regulation by the Queensland Government to stop unjustified price hikes, and has said that discussions are ongoing. If you're spending more on fuel, that makes extra time spent on the roads even more painful. This week, the Brisbane Times released figures obtained from the Department of Transport and Main Roads that predicted how long it would take to drive between Brisbane and the Gold Coast, Ipswich and the Sunshine Coast by 2046, not taking into account any measures to improve infrastructure in the meantime. They projected that driving from the Captain Cook Bridge in Brisbane to Robina on the Gold Coast, which currently takes about an hour to under 2 hours in the afternoon peak, would take anything from an hour and a half to over 2.5 hours. From Rockley to the Cunningham Highway in Ipswich was projected to double by 2046 for commuters travelling home after work, and the stretch from Pine River to Nambour on the Sunshine Coast in PM peak times was projected to increase by around 50%. Academics have pointed out the connection between increased road congestion and housing affordability. Increasing housing prices are pushing people further out from urban centres to where homes are more affordable, which means more people are forced to spend time on the roads commuting to and from work and study, particularly in areas not well serviced by public transport. That brings us to the topic of housing densification to combat urban sprawl, but we'll get to that a few chapters into this video. But next we'll move on to an update on Jack's Law, which allows police to use metal-detecting wands to search people for knives. The law was named after 17-year-old Jack Beasley, who was fatally stabbed outside a Gold Coast convenience store in 2019. When the law was first introduced in 2021, it allowed police to wand people in specific precincts, but was gradually expanded to include more and more locations until mid-last year, when it was once again expanded to include all public places. At the same time, it was made permanent. In the 6 months since then, over 82,500 people have been scanned and over 600 weapons have been seized. Here's a breakdown of how many people were scanned in each area across Greater Brisbane and how many weapons were seized. I found some data that evaluates how successful this kind of initiative is likely to be, and I'll share that later in the My 2 Cents segment. It may be that it's not as clear-cut as it appears on the surface. And now from one law named after a victim of crime to another. Daniel's Law was passed on the last day of 2025, setting up a public child sex offenders register with strict conditions under which the details of offenders could be accessed by the public. Well, this week it was revealed that the first charges have been laid over a breach of those conditions. A man faced court this week in Ipswich for allegedly passing on the details of an offender that he accessed on January 1, the day after the register went live. I will mention that the offence occurred in Lowood in the Somerset LGA, so just outside of Greater Brisbane, but I've included it in this update as the case is being heard in Ipswich. The man was released on bail and will reappear in court on February 4th. I'll let you know that I'm in the process of setting up a second YouTube channel that will feature short clips taken from these update videos for quick bite-sized updates rather than the longer full videos. I'll let you know on the community page when I've started adding content to that. But don't forget that these videos have clickable chapters which you can access on the video's timeline or in the video description so that you can navigate to the updates that you're curious about. But back to the updates. Last week, Brisbane joined capital cities around Australia to mark a day of mourning for the victims of the attack in Bondi last December. City assets were lit up in white and a pillar of light was projected from Southbank. Brisbane clinics are facing a shortage of a number of vaccines due to a distribution centre in Redlands being forced to close when a retaining wall collapsed. This has disrupted deliveries of not only vaccines for babies, but also flu jabs, something elderly Australians may be looking for with an unseasonable flu peak at the moment, and meningococcal B and rabies vaccines also experiencing shortages. So if you're planning travel anytime soon, this may affect you. Now to one of the stories I pointed to earlier in this video when I mentioned the lack of housing supply and also densification of housing. Well, a review by the Queensland Productivity Commission that was delivered to the state government in late 2025 paints a fairly dire picture of the current situation when it comes to efforts to increase housing supply. While demand is historically high, with construction work in the pipeline more than doubling over the last 5 years, actual work being done is not keeping up. Productivity in the industry was shown to have dropped by 9% since 2018, and had it remained at 2018 levels, that would have seen an additional 77,000 homes built, which the report claims would have allowed supply to keep pace with demand. The review points out that productivity in Queensland construction industry in 2025 was only 5% higher than it was 30 years ago. This is mostly put down to two factors: government procurement frameworks and complex and restrictive government regulation. The report made 64 recommendations to turn things around. It claimed that reforming the planning system could reduce growth in home prices by as much as 64%. Of the 64 recommendations, the government accepted 51, either fully or in principle. One that was rejected was a change to zoning laws that allow for higher density housing near key public transport corridors. In Brisbane City Council's jurisdiction, 69% of residential land within 1 kilometre of the rail network is zoned as low density. The state government rejected changing this, saying that this would threaten the unique character of our suburbs, which hinges on the unique identity of the traditional Queenslander home. Another recommendation rejected was for the formation of independent hearings panels made up of planning experts, economists, legal professionals, and former local government officials who hear submissions and evidence on local planning. They would make recommendations to local governments about how plans should be amended. Although councils could reject those recommendations, they would have to provide sound rationale for the decision to do so. The Commission said this would facilitate zoning reforms based on evidence and allow councils to enact changes that would otherwise be politically challenging. With the additional strain the upcoming Olympics will place on the construction industry and housing demand unlikely to do anything but increase in the meantime, this really is a crucial time to take a sober look at how the entire industry operates. While the state government is looking to reform its construction industry, the sponsor of this video, YB Painting, are already getting things right. They recently won first or second place in 5 different categories of the Master Painters Australia Queensland Awards for 2025, and when you see their professionalism and the quality of their workmanship, it's no surprise. With fixed pricing and a 5-year warranty on all their work, you can be sure there'll be no unpleasant surprises. Claim your 10% discount by scanning this QR code or the link in the video description. Moving to LGA-specific updates, and in Brisbane, the largest dairy company in Australia, Lactalis, has announced the historic milk factory in South Brisbane will be shut down. The factory opened in the 1930s and currently employs 202 workers. Lactalis is a French family-owned business and owns brands including Paul's, Oak, and Tamar Valley. It's the world's largest fresh dairy company with over 250 production sites in 94 countries. They say the closure of the South Brisbane facility is due to the location and infrastructure no longer aligning with the demands of a modern, efficient manufacturing network. No doubt you'll be seeing plans for redevelopment of the site sometime soon here on the Brisbane Channel. One thing I've had viewers ask me about is the planned level crossing removal in Coopers Plains, with an elevated 3-way intersection linking Boundary and Orange Grove roads, as well as pedestrian and cycling connections planned. Well, it's looking to be in limbo at the moment. While it has already secured funding from all levels of government, the last update on the state government site was updated in 2024, and it said early works were expected to start in mid-2025. A federal government page updated in October of last year has mid-2026 as the start date, with completion in 2029. But when questioned recently by the ABC, the Department of Transport and Main Roads says they now have no timeline for when work is expected to begin. This has caused outrage among locals after nearby businesses were vacated to prepare for the works. On top of the impact on those businesses, the buildings are reportedly now being used by squatters or other trespassers and vandals, causing concern for local residents. A spokesperson for the Federal Transport Minister, Catherine King, has said that they are working towards a start date, but for now the project is shrouded in uncertainty. If you get anything out of these updates, clicking the like button or sharing on your socials is the best way to help more people benefit. And you can also say thanks by heading to Buy Me a Coffee or becoming a channel member, which gets you access to extra content. Thanks to anyone who has done any of those things. If you watched our video on active transport in Brisbane, or if you're someone who scoots, skates, or rides around Brisbane, you'd know that we have some sections of really great active transport infrastructure and some big gaps in between them. Well, one of those gaps is about to be closed up on the north side. Sylvan Road in Toowong links the Western Freeway Bikeway with the Bicentennial Bikeway, and on weekends sees over 1,100 cycling and e-scooter trips taken. But it's also been voted as Queensland's most unsafe spot to ride, due to the lack of physical separation between active transport and motorists on the 1.2 kilometre stretch, as well as intersections that are by no means active transport friendly. The good news is that after overwhelming community support in the community consultation phases, concept designs for a transformation of Sylvan Road will be released early this year, followed by detailed designs, and early work is set to begin midway through this year. Proposed changes include a separated bikeway and possibly changes to intersections and street parking along the road. Stick with the Brisbane Channel and we'll keep you in the loop. A positive announcement for some Brisbane residents is the completion of 92 social and affordable homes in Chermside, aimed at providing accommodation for both essential workers and people at risk of homelessness. The homes are designed with accessibility and ease of living in mind, with wider hallways, step-free access, safer bathrooms, and flexible layouts that support older Queenslanders and people with mobility needs. Over in Ipswich, residents are being invited to join the Cane Toad Challenge, not only helping reduce the impact of one of our most damaging invasive species, but also getting the chance to win prizes. Any cane toads collected and logged online between January 30 and February 8 will be counted in the challenge. Watergum, the organisation behind the challenge, recommends the RSPCA-approved stepped hypothermia method to euthanize the toads humanely. This involves putting them in the fridge for 1 to 2 days, which puts them into a hibernation-like state, and then into the freezer for the same length of time. The dead toads can then be collected by Watergum to use in the production of cane toad tadpole lures. They haven't revealed what the prizes are, but I'll put the details on the community page of this channel and on the Brisbane Channel's Instagram as soon as they're announced. Last week, we revealed the top books borrowed from Brisbane libraries, and this week it's Ipswich's turn. The most accessed book wasn't a physical book, but an e-book, Onyx Storm by Rebecca Yaros, with 800 ebooks and e-audiobooks downloaded in 2025. In total, there were 150,000 downloads from Ipswich library collections over the year. Top physical books borrowed were Bluey, The Weekend, from the children's section, and for adults, Nobody's Fool, a thriller by New York Times best-selling author Harlan Coben. In Moreton Bay, last week saw the opening of the transformed John Bray Park in Bray Park. The new playground features a scribbly gum moth cocoon play tower, a crawl tunnel in the shape of a tree log, and wet and dry creek beds. The upgrade reflects local feedback with open turf areas for ball games, shaded picnic facilities, and a multi-purpose sport and pickleball court, as well as fitness equipment. An accessible amenities block and car parking has also been added, along with the path connecting the area with Bray Park train station and Strathpine Centre. In addition, over 100 new eucalyptus trees were added to the park. And speaking of gum trees, the Redlands have become the first local government area in southeast Queensland and within the koalas federally listed northern endangered range to report stabilisation of its citywide koala population. Studies by Griffith University and the University of the Sunshine Coast have found no evidence of continued population decline since 2018 in the area. Here on the channel, we've reported on a number of initiatives in the Redlands, including the Redlands Coast Koala Watch and Koala Safe Neighbourhoods, and it seems they're working. Griffith researchers found that since 2020, more koalas have been entering care alive, receiving treatment and successfully being released back into the wild, and this has been attributed to increased public awareness across the LGA. Good job, Redlands! To Logan, where Mayor John Raven is on a campaign to see Logan selected as the location for a special one-off performance by the wildly successful Aussie songstress Tones and I. She recently announced on social media that she would put a special all-ages concert with $10 tickets in the Australian town or city that campaigned the hardest for the show. Raven says that with a diverse culture and over 50% of the city's residents aged 34 or under, Logan would be the perfect choice. He proposed putting on the show in the Kingston Butter Factory Cultural Precinct, which can host 8,500 people. He set up a Facebook event page and invited Logan locals to click going or interested with the deadline of this Sunday, which is today if I got this video out in time. At the time of planning this video, there were 2.1k people who had said they were going and 1.7k listed as interested. I'll put a link in the video description. Well, that's the updates. Let's get to the My 2 Cents segment, and today I'll be sharing what we can see from the only independent review into Jack's Law, the law made permanent in mid-2025 that gives police powers to scan anyone for weapons in any public place. Is it likely to actually reduce knife crime? We'll start by looking a little more closely at the law itself, especially the most recent changes. As mentioned earlier, the law that gives police officers the power to scan people without reasonable suspicion was expanded to all public places in mid-2025. But the changes also removed safeguards such as the need for senior police oversight, reporting requirements, and a further review of the impact of wanding on crime and civil liberties. The big question is, do these new powers actually reduce the rates of knife crime? While there's no publicly available data on the impact of the laws since the changes, beyond the state government's figures on the number of weapons seized that I shared earlier, researchers from Griffith University's Criminology Institute conducted a review of the 12-month trial of Jack's Law on the Gold Coast from 2021 to 2022. On concluding the review, they've stated, "We found there was no reduction in violence as a result of the use of the handheld scanners." They said that confiscated knives are easily replaced, and they found no evidence that scanning deterred people from carrying weapons. They did, however, find that both police and members of the public reported feelings of public safety had improved as a result of the trial, which could be due to increased visibility of police, extra resourcing, and positive media coverage of the trial. So while people felt safer, there was no evidence of an actual reduction in crime associated with the increased detection of weapons. A key concern raised by the research team was that while the legislation was intended to target young people, and that there was an evidence base for the selection of more males than females, there was evidence of inappropriate use of stereotypes and cultural assumptions by a small number of officers in determining who to select for wanding. There were other concerns raised, particularly with the increase in drugs detected in the process of wanding young people, but my main focus here is on the effectiveness of the law in reducing knife crime, which is why it was introduced in the first place. The researchers say that despite the increased detection of weapons, this did not reduce violent crimes involving knives, and not only that, but their findings echo research from the UK showing stop and search laws had no impact on violent crime, and research from Victoria also showed no effect from similar stop and search laws on violent crimes. My 2 cents? It seems that while Jack's Law makes people feel safer in public spaces and does increase detection of weapons carried in public, it does not have any real impact on the actual incidence of related crimes. It's like many initiatives that sound good on the surface and make people feel more at ease, but when assessed on the basis of real and measurable impact, they fall flat. I agree with the researchers from the Criminology Institute when they say that to truly reduce violent assaults using knives, we need to deal with the underlying causes, such as mental health, poverty, child maltreatment, and domestic and family violence. After all, around 50% of serious violent crime occurs in private settings, in people's homes. Wanding does nothing to help those victims. We really should be asking why people are carrying knives in the first place and dealing with that. Of course, there's also people who carry knives with no ill intent. When I was in my early teens, my mother gave me a Swiss Army knife. It was a sign of trust, and I certainly never had any intention of using it as a weapon. But I wonder if by criminalizing every little thing, perhaps we're making things worse. A young person carrying a knife is only a problem if they have the intent to do harm with it. So how about we focus more on why that would be and working on reducing whatever would lead to them becoming like that? Of course, prevention is a long-term thing, and paying attention to that doesn't mean we don't try to stop the people who are already on the streets with sinister intentions, or that we don't ensure there are consequences for those that do offend. But we really do need to take a holistic approach, one that is based on the evidence of what works and what doesn't, even if that means it's more of a long-term endeavour that may not show results until a few years down the track. If we really want to see societal change, that's not something that can occur in a single election cycle, but it is enough time to begin a process. And I hope more than anything for leadership to increasingly focus on real change, not just the optics and public sentiment. That's the idealist in me, but the realist knows that's unlikely. But I'll keep looking for the small wins, and no matter who's running things, I'll always try to see the actions taken and decisions made from as objective a position as possible. Now over to you. What are your thoughts? Join in the conversation in the comments. The next midweek video on the channel will be the long-promised one on Brisbane's hidden disabilities, and an initiative you may have never heard of, but one that's well worth being aware of. See ya.